This evening on Hemispheres, we're going to be speaking with Vic Perlo, who is the chair of the Economics Commission of the Communist Party USA. We'll be speaking to Vic from his home in New York to talk about the recently concluded G7+1 conference and related issues of global economics. So, Vic, are you there? Vic?
Oh, hi.
Hello.
The thing just came in from the AFL-CIO on the facts, reporting on the demonstration of 125,000 in Detroit in support of locked out workers at Gannett and Knight Ridder. And I thought that your listeners might want to know about it and take some supporting action in Denver, too. Anyhow, this last weekend, there met in Denver the heads of the state of the 7.5.
7.5.
That is, the top 7 imperialist plunderers and the leading plunderee, Yeltsin, who was included as a reward for his welcoming NATO troops at the former Soviet borders. Yeltsin's entrance fee was forgiveness of the $100 billion in debts owed Russia by former socialist countries for loans to them by the Soviet Union. But there was no mention of canceling the debt of the billions Russia owes to German and U.S. banks for loans made to it. Yeltsin got a pat on the back to take home to the Russian people, who are suffering from unpaid wages, mass unemployment, incredible profiteering and corruption, destruction of the Soviet economy, and its unmatched social safety net. The Denver meeting was the occasion for Clinton to boast of the supposedly superior U.S. economy based on entrepreneurship, quote, risk-taking, and, quote, creative destruction. No kidding, this phrase is used. What has been created is the outrageous incomes of 400 billionaires and a Dow Jones average nearing 8,000. What is being destroyed are the lives of millions of downsized workers, bankrupted small business, ruined farmers, and particularly the untold number of victims of accelerated racism. While U.S. spokespeople deplored the policies of France's socialist government, creation of hundreds of thousands of public sector jobs, and reduction of the work week to 35 hours with no cut in pay. A president of a corporation of storage technology, a Denver area corporation, was absolutely amazed at this call for 35 hours a week. Imagine getting paid for working only 35 hours. Now, it just happens that his company went through bankruptcy and was helped to get out of it by the U.S. government, which doesn't want to do anything to help workers who are going bankrupt in record numbers this year. Of course, the U.S. formula is not very popular. The New York Times headline put it, U.S. prescription for economic growth finds no summit followers. And the so-called summit was soon off the front pages to be displaced by the tobacco settlement. And as for Yeltsin, he was permitted all the photo ops, but he was excluded when the 7 really wanted to talk about the business-like financial matters. More significant than the posturing in Denver is the development of groups of emerging countries seeking to cooperate independently of imperialist domination. The oldest is OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is now hampered by U.S. economic warfare and blockades against Iraq, Iran, and Algeria, among others. What happened was that these governments nationalized the oil in the early 1970s, and that permitted them for the first time to get a decent price for their oil. And U.S. and other oil companies, their governments want to privatize and get it back for the former owners. It's as simple as that. And they're using all of this political pressure and military pressure against Iraq, especially with that in view.
You know, let's go back to this New York Times headline that you mentioned, because that seems kind of interesting. Do you suppose...
Can you talk a little louder?
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you suppose that the G7, well, the others in the G7, that their reaction would have been the same if this meeting had been held prior to the recent elections in France and in England?
Well,
I'm wondering if they're feeling chastened.
Well, I think that it really didn't make that much difference in the sense that the German representative, Kohl, who is a figure in German politics equivalent to Reagan in the United States, is still represented. And the French representative is not the man now elected premier, but the president, who is a representative of the right-wing coalition. And Tony Blair, the English Labourite, is doing his best to act like a Tory. So it doesn't really make that much difference in the tone of the conference. You see, the objective drive of the United States government in that conference is to intensify the pressure on other governments to adopt the kind of policies we're getting in this country. That is, you know, under the guise of budget balancing, hitting people's needs and cutting the social safety net. And that is, in Europe, that is happening through the drive to get a single European currency, the euro. And unrealistic goals have been established. They have to reduce their budget deficit to below 3% of the GNP, etc. And to do that, they're going to have to cut their social safety net. And that's what is going on there. But of course, there is very strong resistance to it in all of the countries. And the elections do reflect that. It's mass actions, however, that will determine the outcome in the final analysis. What I wanted to say was that more significant than what went on in Denver was the development of the groups of emerging countries. I mentioned OPEC. There's also ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which includes South Korea, Singapore, the Philippines, and that's an increasingly important factor in the world economy. In our hemisphere, the most significant development is Mercosur, MERCOSUR, Market South. The southern cone nations of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, which is gradually moving toward integration of their economies. It operates in what has been, and still is, the happy hunting ground and of plundering and profiteering by transnationals, especially U.S. transnationals, in industry and finance. It is seen in Washington as a threat to U.S. economic and political domination of South America. At a recent meeting of the Organization of American States in Brazil, U.S. Foreign Trade Representative Charlene Barshevsky, she bluntly demanded that Brazil break up Mercosur, a demand that Brazil rejected. But the fact that the government has been closely tied to Washington ever since the start of the dictatorship of Pinochet, the CIA-connected murderer of several thousand Chileans. The Chile's government still carries out the policies of austerity, privatization dictated by Washington, and is now negotiating for NAFTA-like relations, extension of NAFTA to the U.S. and Chile, which would have further damage to American and Chilean workers. There has been a formal group in the south of Africa, but it hadn't amounted to anything. The newest group, which is still in formation and which has important prospects, has been made possible by the overthrow of Mobutu and the victory of the National Alliance of Democratic Forces headed by Laurent Kabila in Congo. It is the first time an African grouping is seeking an effective independent course of economic development without the domination of U.S., British, or French imperialism. An Associated Press dispatch from Nairobi in April, while the liberation armies had not yet taken Kinshasa, stated that, and I quote, "The end of Mobutu's 3-decade reign of corruption and kleptocracy opens up the center of Africa to new alignments independent of European or United States interests. Indeed, nations in eastern and southern Africa are looking towards the Indian Ocean rim, stretching from India and Pakistan down through Mauritius and on to South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Uganda, and now Congo." Angola was omitted accidentally from the list of participants. Since the end of apartheid, South Africa has rushed to do business in what is a natural market, the rest of Africa. A peaceful and relatively prosperous Congo will buy South African products and will ship its minerals south through Zambia. It's as an indication of the developing economic cooperation. The AP article noted that Ugandan businessmen are already opening banks in eastern Zaire and supplying shops with everything from bed linens to boom boxes. And of course, the capitalists of U.S. and other Western countries are rushing to the mineral area of the Congo to try to make contracts with the new government. The old government had a formal state company, Gecko Mines, which controlled the mining industry supposedly, but was riddled with corruption and was ineffective, and production went way down. And the new government promptly fired the old bureaucrats, nationalized the railroad, which handles the material, and I think it has concluded, but very carefully and on terms which protect Congolese interests, some contracts. It's very interesting. This was an unusual kind of army and war. While the Mobutu troops in retreating were notorious for their looting and their wrecking activities in every town and city they left, the behavior of the advancing forces of the Democratic Alliance was spotless, perfect. And, even though attempt was made to raise a human rights issue over an incident involving refugees from Rwanda, the army consisted largely of young people, young men, and teenagers, who volunteered and joined because they supported the cause of Kabila and prospects of that new government are excellent, because I think that they will resist the pressure of the U.S. government to follow the typical policies of depending on foreign aid and making concessions for that purpose.
Vic, given this new world context, the development of new blocks of nations in different parts of the world, how significant is the lack of consensus at the G7 summit?
The lack of what?
The lack of consensus. The fact that the Europeans and Japanese did reject the U.S. model.
Oh, I see. Well, I don't think that... I think that the conflicts among the European powers over such questions of the euro and generally accepting U.S. policies can become very significant. I think that we don't have the answer yet. In other words, it depends upon whether the differences get beyond the differences among politicians and become a question of mass action. I think that that's the point, that the politicians, unfortunately, are capitalist politicians, and they will tend to follow the interests of their corporations, which will, on the whole, coincide with those of the U.S. government. They will want to put over the same privatization, austerity programs, etc. They have a tougher time doing it because the unions are much stronger in Western Europe, and there are stronger communist parties, etc.
Is it necessary for there to be some division among the imperialist powers for these new blocs in the Third World to succeed?
Well, I think there are differences, but I don't think that... I think there may be a tendency to exaggerate them. For example, it is pointed out that there was rivalry between France and the United States over the dominance of the Congo. However, U.S., French, and Belgian troops were all poised in Brazzaville across the river from Kinshasa, the capital of Congo, ready to invade together, jointly, if the occasion made it propitious. And I think that that's the main thing. The tendency there, as has been proven in Bosnia and everywhere else, is for differences to be subdued and to be made secondary to the dominant tendency of the other governments to go along with the United States, which has such tremendous military power and forces in 100 countries and control of the world's oceans and air, etc. It's interesting that they no longer bother to go through formalities of being invited to invade a country. For example, the going into Santa Lucia to take out the foreigners from the capital there, they just went in, the troops of the United States, Britain, etc., without asking anybody's permission. And that's a normal process now.
Is it possible, though, for these developing blocks of nations to compete with the G7, to actually get reasonable terms for trade and to prosper in and of themselves?
It's possible, but admittedly, it's very difficult. They face very big handicaps in trying to do it. The fact that OPEC had very substantial success indicates that possibilities do exist. And I think that part of it is, depends upon the developing economic situation in the United States and in other capitalist countries. Recently, the United States has escaped the depressions and financial crises that have afflicted Japan and West European countries. However, I think it's widely understood that this won't go on forever. And when weaknesses in the U.S. economy emerge, the conditions of these newer groups to make some progress will improve. But admittedly, it is not an easy process, and it can't depend solely on the governments. It depends upon the extent of mass movements within these countries. And that, frankly, is what's so helpful about this new African situation, because you have progressive-oriented governments in Rwanda, Uganda, Congo, and Angola. And that gives it a very good political base that, however, the difficulties are very great. I wouldn't try to minimize them.
And what about the prospects of trade relationships between the groups themselves, between Africans and Latin Americans, for example?
Well, yeah, I think that those prospects are important, and they can become more important because of the development of substantial industry in Brazil, for example. However, one has to recognize that the governments in power in the Latin American countries are not progressive governments, generally speaking, and that is a difficulty. And as the AP dispatch indicated, the tendency of the Central African countries is to orient on cooperation with developing countries in Asia, like India, Pakistan, etc. And I think that is a logical thing, and it would help both groups, both the Asian and the African countries, achieve independent development. Rolanda Brath, who is a commentator associated with radio station WBAI and a leader in a Patrice Lumumba coalition, he had a telephone interview with Kabila before the war was finished. And to my mind, the most interesting question was, what do you want from the United States? To which Kabila replied, just to leave us alone. And he acted that way. He rebuffed the attempts of Bill Richardson, Clinton's appointee, to involve himself and dictate terms and to create some sort of a compromise between Kabila and Mobutu, and to bring in bourgeois politicians like Tshisekedi. He wouldn't do it. I mean, Kabila wouldn't go along with that. And so they are stressing their political independence of the U.S. government, even while they're cooperating with U.S. economic interests.
I'd like to take just a moment here to let listeners know that they're tuned into Hemispheres, a weekly feature on KGNU on Tuesdays. We're speaking with Vic Perlo, who's chair of the Economics Commission of the Communist Party USA, and we'll be taking your calls in just a few minutes. Before we get to the phone calls, Vic, I think we should talk just briefly about your new book.
Well, my new book, Economics of Racism 2, I better tell you a little bit about how it came about. My first book on that subject, full-text scale book, Economics of Racism, was published in 75. And with the great developments of this problem, the important increase in the Hispanic population, the Asian population, with the new features of racism in the United States, there was a lot of pressure on me to write an update. Well, economic racism, too, is much more than an update. I've covered a much broader range of topics than are covered in the original book. And I think that I will just mention two of the features that I think are important. And one is the police and judicial terror against the African American people especially. That's a most serious problem, and it has gotten worse. And there's a lot of material in the book about it, but what I wanted to mention is here's a very dramatic set of figures. The percentage of white people and black people who use narcotic drugs is the same, that is 13%. But blacks are 4 times more likely to be arrested, 8 times more likely to be convicted, and 19 times more likely to be imprisoned for drug situations. And the use of the police to terrorize and really take criminal action against especially the African American population, but also Hispanic people, is very brazen, and it has resulted in mass imprisonment of the black youth, especially young black men, and there used to be lynchings, and now there are police shootings and killings without any real provocation of blacks practically every week. And that is a situation which is getting worse since President Clinton's bill against crime was enacted, which is used for that purpose. That's one of the topics I wanted to call your attention to, and I think that you'll find the material on it very useful. The book is available from international publishers in New York, 235 West 23rd Street, New York 10011, for I think in paperback $9.95 or something like that.
And
the U.S. in politics uses the so-called human rights issue. For example, it's used against China, and mainly to make the American people hostile to China. Well, let's look at the record. China has 1/5 the U.S. crime rate, 1/20th the U.S. rape rate, and less than 1/4 the U.S. rate of imprisonment. And who is responsible for this? Well, I think that one can say that the capitalist class, in this sense, the capitalist class finances the mayors who appoint the police chiefs and protect the police system of cruelty, etc. There's a quotation from the newspaper. Businessmen stood up and cheered in Massachusetts when Senator Edward Kennedy announced that Fort Devens, slated for closure, would be converted to a federal prison. There's a corporation, Corrections Corporation, which specializes
Vic, could you speak up just a little bit?
in privatization of prisons. And since 1993, the price of its stock has multiplied 20 times, its profits 5 times, and this year it is adding 15,000 prison beds to privately owned and operated prisons in America. I think that that's one feature that's important. Another feature of the book that I think differs from a lot of others.
Vic, just a sec. Could you speak up just a little bit?
What's that?
Could you?
A feature that is particularly significant is that I go into the profits that are made from racism. You see, the liberal approach is the following, that yes, the blacks lose very much from racial differentials, but so does everybody else because it reduces mass consuming power, and hence it's bad for business. The businessmen, capitalists make less because their customers are able to buy less. Now, that is a sort of Simple Simon argument because the effect of the differential, the primary effect, and the reason for it is extra profits for the capitalists. And in the book I make estimates of what these extra profits are, and it comes to something earlier in this decade, it was $200 billion a year of extra profits that were made from racism within the United States, in addition to the effect of lower wages for blacks and Hispanics on pulling down the wages of white workers. And this racism extends internationally. It helps make the tremendous profits which U.S. corporations get in places like South America, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Yeah, those are the main features that are, I think, especially important in my book.
Now, how is it that you come up with that figure, $200 billion?
Oh.
How do you measure that?
Well, I take the difference in the average wages or salaries of black and white workers, and I apply it to all of the black, Hispanic, etc. workers in the private sector that are employed by private employers who therefore benefit from this differential. And I take into consideration that all of the studies show that with similar education, with similar acquirement of skill, the differential is practically the same. It isn't a question of lesser abilities, in other words.
So that's a pretty straightforward formula.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty dramatic.
Yes, it is.
A simple formula, and that's the result it leads, is that there's this surplus profit of $200 billion. We have a first caller on the line here. Let's see if we can make this work out. And we have Cord on the line from Boulder.
Hello.
Hi there.
Yes, Richard, good show. I wanted to ask Vic Perlo regarding the G7. You know, we noticed that there was a sort of a void in the agenda with respect to Cuba. One might have expected that, given the contentiousness regarding Helms-Burton between the European Union and the U.S., that might have been raised. However, given what you said before, Vic, about them the imperialists sort of wanting to subdue these secondary questions in favor of the overall scheme, how do you think this contention over Helms-Burton may be resolved? I know that the Europeans are threatening action at the World Trade Organization, and the administration has gone way out on a limb on this and implied that they'll just sort of walk away from any negative decision at the WTO. How do you think that will be played out?
Well, not because I consider it unimportant. In March 1959, 3 months after the revolution, my wife and I drove down to Key West and for $16, we had a flight to Havana. And the joy of the Cuban people in their revolution was so apparent. It was one of the most exciting things I saw. And the opening of the private pools, etc., to the ordinary working people, and of the restaurants and this and that, the immediate gains of the people of Cuba were very striking. Anyhow, I think it's tremendously important the way that Cuba has held out under this terrific pressure from the U.S. And I think the problem is this, that I think that there is an increasing tendency of Latin American countries to cooperate with Cuba. So far, it takes more or less symbolic forms. That is, Fidel Castro is invited to meet when they have gatherings, etc. It doesn't take into account practical economic assistance, which the Cubans need, and similarly, the resistance of European countries to Helms-Burton has been fairly strong verbally, but then qualified by saying they deplore the Cuban human rights record, etc. And they don't really do anything about it. They threaten to do things about it, and they don't do very much that's effective. But I think that these actions against U.S. policy are going to increase, and I think what's particularly is important is the increasing tendency of American groups, U.S. groups, to defy the ban and travel to Cuba, and there's going to be a big youth conference there this summer. And, there's this increasing activity and improved leadership of the AFL-CIO in the United States. I think if the AFL-CIO really got into that kind of a struggle, it would really make the difference and bring about a decisive victory.
I'd just like to mention as a sort of an aside that with regard to humanitarian assistance being sent to Cuba, there's currently a bill that has been offered by Congressman Torres and Congressman Leach, a bipartisan bill to eliminate most of the restrictions on aid to Cuba that fall under the Helms-Burton bill. So we're encouraging folks that might want to give our two Congress people in the area, Congressman Skaggs and Congresswoman, to get a call or write them to encourage them to sign on to H.R. 1951. That's that bill, 1951.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your call.
Thank you, Richard.
And, Vic?
Hello.
To return to the economics of racism, and I should also mention that we are taking calls from listeners. So if you have a question, we're speaking with Vic Perlo from New York, who's the chair of the Economics Commission of the Communist Party USA, and author of a new book, The Economics of Racism 2. Vic, is it possible to measure the effect of racism on the income of working people in general?
Well,
since white people also are making less money, since wages are being taken down by racist practices, is it possible to get a handle on that, the magnitude of that?
not with any degree of accuracy, but my approach has been the following. The losses of blacks and Hispanics, etc., from racism come to more than $500 billion a year. You see, those losses are much more than the extra profits that the capitalists get, because some of the losses are simply due to unemployment, to the discrimination in pensions and thrown out that the losses of white people, white workers, are equal to these losses. There is not I don't know of a scientific way of measuring what the losses of white workers due to racism are. But take, for example, the reduction in real wages. The reduction in real wages, which has been about 20% since 1973, has coincided with an increase in economic discrimination against blacks. And that is one indication of how much it has hurt workers in general, including, of course, white workers, very much so. The reduction in the real minimum wage is another example. So I think that one can say that the estimate that white workers lose at least as much as black and Hispanic and Asian workers do is a very reasonable assumption.
And that would be the larger amount that you mentioned, the $500 billion.
That's right. That would mean that
every year?
The total losses of the working class in the United States, it comes to more than $1 trillion a year. A trillion being a million.
It's a stunning figure to think about.
Yeah, that sure is.
And what is the gross domestic product of the United States these days?
I'm sorry. You'd better speak more loudly.
I'm sorry. What is the gross domestic product in the United States these days?
It's about $7 trillion. So these losses amount to 1/7 of the gross domestic product.
Yeah, it's shocking.
It
shocking.
is, yeah.
You mentioned, with regards to Cuba anyway, new progressive leadership in the industrial unions. It seems like, given those kinds of figures, that people should be rushing out to join their local union to demand some of that money back.
Well, I think that the people are joining unions. The organizing drives are having a lot of success. In many cases involving small numbers of workers, but every week there are literally a score of announcements of new unionization victories. But one has to recognize that the legal obstacles and the political obstacles to labor have always been severe, and they remain very severe. And of course, that's especially true in southern states and other states where so-called right-to-work laws make unionization particularly difficult. After all, the obstacle to unionization has been strong throughout the history of the United States, and what really broke through in the 1930s and 40s was a new militant level of struggle and the growth of the Communist Party and the activity of communists. And, of course, the McCarthy period was directed against that, and a new generation of union leaders came to power that capitulated to the government, and under them, the trade unions went rapidly downhill. And there's just the beginning of revival now. One can't say that there's the same degree of militancy as was shown in the 1930s, but the direction is positive.
One other thing you mentioned earlier was the rise in prison population.
Rise in what?
In prisons.
Oh, yeah.
And the number of people in prisons. And some people have started talking about a prison industrial complex. as prisons move towards using prison labor. What observations do you have about that in the book?
Well, there is discussion of it in the book, and you know, I don't know if you remember that historically, chain gangs were used in the southern states against black prisons for forced labor on the roads, etc. Well, it was in 1959, driving through the southern states, that I saw these things. And then during the civil rights movement, civil rights laws, they were stopped. But now there are reports in the press that they are coming back again. The government of Alabama and other states are reinstituting these chain gangs. And that is just one indication of the intensification of racism. Of course, the workfare process, whereby people who have been on welfare are forced to work for sub-minimum wages, is allied to the use of prison labor, which has always been used to make license plates and various other products, and of course for just pennies in pay.
And how large are the implications of that kind of economic activity?
It has not. It potentially, it could be very large. I mean, there has been the expressed desire of leaders of capitalist finance and industry that to settle the differential between U.S. wages and wages, let's say, in Latin America, by pushing Latin American wages down to the Latin American level. And this is used to push in that direction. There's no question that American workers are facing a particularly difficult situation, and one in which the insecurity is increasing. People that have jobs are more fearful of losing them, and people that have decent jobs are more and more being forced into poor jobs that pay very little, and so it's notorious that the income differentials between the very rich and the poor in the United States are far greater than in any other industrialized country. And that makes for a very backward and reactionary political climate, whether Republicans or Democrats are in power.
How do those income differentials compare between today and the 1930s?
Well, the 1930s, of course, we don't have figures, but for the period, as far back as we have comparisons, which go back to about 1950, one can say that the extent of income differentiation has roughly tripled. That is, the gap between the rich and the poor has multiplied 3 times. That's a very round figure that, you know, I've written articles and things which go into this in more detail, and it's also discussed in the Economics of Racism 2 book.
Would you hazard a guess about what it was like in the 30s?
Well, you see, in the 1930s, don't forget you had the Great Depression, in which there were millions of people who were homeless, who had no income whatsoever, and at the same time, a lot of the wealthy people had lost a lot of money in the crisis. percent. You can't quantify that as a percentage differential, as you could, for example, the differential between a executive that gets $10 million and a worker who gets $10,000. That's a 100% differential. But when workers are getting zero, it doesn't matter how much the others are getting. You can't give a percentage differential.
I understand. It's very diplomatic of you. What other observations do you have of what transpired at the G7 conference that listeners might want to be aware of?
I don't have too much information about what actually went on there. Very little has been reported, and except for generalities. I want to make some references to the Wall Street Journal article last Thursday, which talks about a briefing paper that was submitted by Clinton to the visiting notaries, and in which it gave the U.S. concept of the official U.S. concept of economic policy and why the U.S. was doing so good. And it showed its claim the process of economic change inevitably involves a certain amount of creative destruction. And it talks about how that happened in Denver, that the previous period of prosperity ended in a bust, but now you find a recreation with the boom based on high-tech industries. And then there's this business of the fellow who, one basic tactic for reallocating resources is the ruthless firing of workers, a common American practice that horrifies most Europeans and Japanese. And that's and the U.S. has done a better job of creating unemployment, but Europe has done a better job of maintaining wages for those staying employed. Well, the question of how well employment is maintained in the United States is really a moot question, because while the given percentage of unemployment as officially measured may be low, a very large percentage, as many as 20-25% of all workers, experience periods of unemployment during the year, much more so than is the case in West European countries.
What does that phrase "creative destruction" mean? Creative destruction. What do they mean by that?
Well, they mean that, for example, there was a record number of bankruptcies in last year, as a matter of fact. And out of all these people that set up businesses and lose them, a advance in technology and so on makes the conditions for the opening up of new enterprises that are successful and that are better than the old ones. They're better because they're more able to fire workers and to get higher productivity of labor without paying for it. That is broadly the broad general concept. When President Clinton personally tried talking about it, he got involved in some sort of mystic comment. He didn't quite know how to express himself. It's not a very clear conception, but it does refer to the overall anti-labor, anti-people, racist drive of the present administration. Take this take the responsibility of capitalist class for racism is revealed, for example, in the campaign against affirmative action. Now, it's true that campaign was conducted by politicians, and it was very successful voting in California. But look what happened. There are all of these great corporations which operate out of California, and corporations are currently at great pains to show pictures of blacks and Latinos in all of their advertisements, their annual reports, etc., to show how conscious they are of this and how they are taking action to eliminate or reduce the previous discrimination. But if these corporations had devoted the same kind of money and advertising, etc., to support affirmative action, this law would have never passed in California, whereas they were paying for the politicians who were opposing affirmative action.
And we have just probably a little less than a minute here, but I wanted to ask you real quick, in the first book of Economics of Racism in 1975, what was the profit differential derived from racism at that time?
Hold on a sec.
Hold on a sec. You know, I have to confess it's kind of hard to hold on a sec on radio because we have that problem with dead air. So we'll have to find a way of getting around that. I think I found a way. We've been speaking with Vic Perlo, chair of the Economics Commission of the Communist Party USA, who's stepped away from the phone just a moment to look up a quick number for us. Vic had mentioned that the profits derived from racism as a direct result of racism amount to $200 billion a year. $200 billion a year in 1996. And he's looking up for us real quick the figure from 1975.
The figure I had there.
Yeah. Are we close to getting it?
Yeah, the figure I used, the roughly estimated total of extra profits made from super exploitation of Chicano, Puerto Rican, Native American, and Asian wage and salary workers comes to $7 billion. Added to the $16 billion derived from black workers makes a total of $23 billion. And now we're talking of more than $200 billion. So it's about a 9 or 10-fold increase.
In 20 years.
In 20 years, yeah.
Well, unfortunately, Vic, we've run out of time. It's been a great pleasure talking with you. I thank you very much for taking the time.
I've enjoyed the session very much, too.
All right.
Okay, we'll be talking again, I hope.
Yes, please, and have a good evening.
Good night.
You've been listening to Hemispheres. Coming up next, we have Corriente.